Welcome everyone to another episode of Reimagining Cyber. Rob here, and our guest today is Dr. Andrew Reeves, an Australian-based expert of cyberpsychology and Deputy Director of the University of New South Wales Institute for Cybersecurity. Andrew has previously served as Director of Organizational and Behavioral Research at cyberminds.org, a non-for-profit providing services and support to those impacted by the heavy demands of defending critical systems and services from cyber attacks, where he undertook the first national baseline of mental well-being in the cybersecurity sector. This is a topic we've not discussed in the past, maybe surface level in some other episodes, but just such a critical one. And it's great to have Andrew here with us today. Andrew, before we get started, any additional background you'd like to share?
Only that I consider myself a bit of a weirdo, and so I'm very happy to be invited to come on the podcast with you, Rob. I originally studied to be a psychologist, and I still keep up that registration. And somewhere along the way, I was attracted to the dark side of cybersecurity, and really found a love of finding the different ways that human behavior and human psychology can help us actually turn the table on the attacker, defend our networks better, and also protect our people. So I'm really excited to talk about this with you.
I am as well, because I think it's, as we were chatting before, I had no idea that this is something that, an organization had done. And, you've obviously led the way in the great research that's been conducted. So let's kind of just discuss this, right? So, you've previously referred to things as kind of this focus around, the human aspects of cybersecurity having three distinct types. Maybe just kind of top level, what are those three distinct types? And then we'll get into them in more depth.
Yeah. So, we normally when we talk about cybersecurity, we think of it very technical. We like to think of a hacker in their basement with big headphones on and all that sort of stuff. I had to come at it much more from a human perspective. The three types have come out of my research, which is the first is the target, which is essentially anyone. If you work for an organization that the attacker wants access to, you can be a target. The second is the defender, which is essentially the good guy, the person who's working in a SOC or working in some system infrastructure role, whose job is to protect the systems. They're a person too, so they have their own vulnerabilities and they're under incredible pressure, and we'll definitely talk more about that. And third is the attacker, which I think often gets less left out. The attacker is a human, is a person, and that means they're vulnerable to the same cognitive biases that the rest of us are. And unlike the other two groups, we should be trying to encourage the cognitive bias and the mistakes in that attacker group. So they're the three that I've focused on.
Excellent. So let's get started with the target, right? You kind of touched upon it, but maybe a little bit deeper dive on the definition of this type, and then potentially some best practices you would suggest and kind of strengthen their mindset overall. Yeah,
so this focus, sometimes I call them target, sometimes I call them victim. I'm not sure which term I like better. But, it comes from a really common question that I get. These days, thankfully, I don't get the question so much from leadership figures, but I certainly get it from people in organizations, which is, are we safe now? Or are we secure now? We pushed ourselves up to a certain level of sophistication on the Essential 8, or we implemented this tool or whatever it is. Are we safe now? And the metaphor I always use is, well, you have to think of it like a safe, right? With a safe, you can have it be very technically sophisticated. You can have it made out of very strong metal. You can have it resistant to having its hinges blown off and all that sort of stuff. But someone has a legitimate access to get into that safe, which is the owner, right? And that means there's a code to get into it. And if the owner is tricked into giving out that code, then all of those technical defenses may as well not be there. And that's a similar situation that we find ourselves in with cyber. Your employees have a genuine reason and need to get into certain systems. The people in finance have a genuine need to get into certain financial systems. The people in IT have a genuine need to get into certain systems, which means they have access. Now, we can make it harder for the attacker to copy those routes, but it's very difficult to actually shut the door entirely. And if an attacker can simply trick an employee into giving out a password, giving out a multi-factor authentication code, which is becoming more common, uh, they can wander through the door the same way the employee can, right? So uh, that's why I spend so much time talking about the target or the victim or whatever you want to call it, because um, if we can get their behavior right, if we can encourage them to be on the lookout, alert, aware of the risks, then that helps shut that final door that attackers can otherwise come through.
Let's hone in on the attacker. And
Mm.
when you look at the attacker and all the great research that you've conducted here, what are some of those psychological aspects that you kind of apply to them? What are some of the approaches that, you've seen that deliver some positive results relative to the attacker?
Well, it's interesting because the nice thing about looking at both the defender and the attacker is that we get to use the same models of decision making, but we
Mm-hmm.
just come at them from a different way. And one of the models I tend to go back to is essentially a dual process model for any psychologist listening, which is a heuristic and systematic model that says that when people make decisions, they tend to make them either quickly and intuitively, or they make them slowly and deliberatively. It's very much a simplification, but it can be a useful model. When we're talking about the defender or the target, it can be used against them. So in a lot of social engineering and phishing and things like that, they will try to get people to click on something and do something before they've even really thought about what they're doing. But we can take that same approach and flip it onto onto the attacker, because the attacker too, as I said, is human. Many of them, it depends on where they come from, but many of them are well practiced in what they do, which means they've formed habits. It means they've formed intuitions. It means they've formed things that they will recognize. There's another model we use called recognition prime decision making, which essentially means that when someone's well practiced at something, they will, rather than running through a strict list of pros and cons and quote unquote rational decision making, they will tend to just do things they've seen done before successfully. And the attackers are no different. So when they enter a network, they won't necessarily go through what the quote unquote rational path is to get to their target. They might not, for example, take the shortest path from where they enter to where their target is. Instead, they will tend to go down what they feel most confident in exploiting, what they feel most likely is to succeed based on their own experience, not actually based on any objective truth of whether that truly is the most likely path to succeed. It's just the one they think is. And in one of the experiments we've been running, you can actually track that. You can observe that behavior through a network and use it to put things in their way. For example, a lure or a deterrent or something that will just confuse them, by picking up on those things that they look at and go, that's interesting. I'll go down that route. So that's one thing. The other thing you can do is mess with their cognition a little bit, and you're doing that by announcing that you are messing with them. This is one of those great psychological things: is that if you tell someone that you're deceiving them, that itself, regardless of what you've actually done, that itself can change behavior in ways that's useful. So there's, I could go on at length with this one, but there's a piece of work we're doing that's looking at if an organization, for example, partners with a vendor that can put deception technology and lures and things like that into your networks. And when you partner with that organization, you do some sort of media release that says, hey, we're partnering with these people. Does that itself change attacker behavior? And if so, is that itself an exploitable route we can take? And, I know we have to talk about lots of things, but if you want me to keep talking about this, I can. We've actually found some really interesting stuff there. And essentially the short answer is yes, you can actually use that as a tool.
It's a deterrent. It's interesting because we always talk about, as you were alluding to, how do you make it more difficult for the attacker? And by making it more difficult, as they're kind of going through their playbook, if you will, and they're seeing that this technical control's been put in place, or this other thing's been put in place. maybe my time should not be invested on this particular organization I'm trying to go after, and therefore I'm going to pivot and go somewhere else. And that's a great deterrent of basically just putting something out as a press release that throws them off and says, well, I'm not going to even bother there. That's a very simple approach, but obviously effective as well. So that's interesting to hear. Well,
Yeah, it really depends, I think, on the attacker. So some of them, if they're not particularly interested in you specifically, they're just interested in attacking someone. So say a ransomware gang, they just want to get into anything they can, then they might, we still haven't quite got the evidence to say this with any strength, but they might consider just going for a softer target. Alternatively, at the very least, if the deception tech you've deployed into your network acts as a bit of a tripwire, it seems like the ransomware gangs are the ones that aren't going to change their behavior all that much. They're going to run through their normal playbook. If they get detected and flushed out, they just move on to another target and it's fine. So at the very least, it's done its job as a tripwire. But for those that are interested in making life easier for themselves, they might just avoid you. So we did see that. The other thing we saw is that it can, to some, there will be some attackers that are very interested in you. And they won't just choose to go somewhere else. They want you. Now, for them, announcing that you're using this kind of active defense, if we want to call it that, this sort of deception against them, it doesn't necessarily change the tools that they will use or the tactics, but it does make them slow down. That seems to be what we're finding, is that they will take longer. Whether that's because there's a little bit of decision paralysis, whether that's just because they don't feel as comfortable relying on their intuitions anymore. At the very least, it seems to give us more time to detect, respond, and flush out. And an example of that is in one study was that we had this simulated network, and there was an asset on the network that was a pretty obvious vulnerability. It was an old, unpatched box of some description. It, to be honest, really shouldn't have been there. This simulated network was a mirror of a real-world network, so we kept it accurate by actually putting this in there, but it was clearly something that shouldn't actually be on any production network. But as we know, it
happens.
Yeah. So when the participants that we had in the sample, who were red teamers playing the part of attackers in this case, when they weren't aware that we were using deception against them on this network, well, I should say when we hadn't told them that we were using deception on the network, they hit that box every time. They wanted to go down and exploit that vulnerability.
It's a soft target. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Low hanging fruit.
Yeah.
When we told them in a separate sample that same network, nothing had changed, but we just announced we're using deception on the network, they found that too good to be true and they avoided it.
Mm.
They thought it must be a lure. They thought it must be a honeypot.
There you go.
Now, on the real network, there were no deceptive assets. It was all real. The only thing we changed was the perception. And so in a way, it almost shielded that vulnerability from being exploited simply by announcing it. Now, we're not necessarily suggesting that organizations should go out and just announce they're doing things that they're not doing. I don't think that necessarily works. But I did have someone come up to me after I gave a talk about this at a conference. And he said, because he'd asked that question, should we just announce things and we haven't done it? And I said, well, no, but he came up and he said, you know what, you've calmed me down a bit, because as always is the case, sometimes you announce you're going to do something and then 10 months later you're still working on implementing it. And he said, you've relaxed me at least because we've announced it.
That helps. Half the battle. Yeah, right.
Exactly. We haven't quite got it into production yet, but at least we've put the press release out.
No, for sure. And that's, again, to your point earlier, this is the psychological, obviously, aspects of all of this. So delving deeper into the defender, the third type, and probably the majority, Andrew, of our audience. So we've discussed, obviously, the high pressures put on the defenders that do lead, unfortunately, to, mental aspects of high stress and burnout. And then you talked about, right, the short-term, job life of some of the folks that are coming into the cyber field. Because I kind of agree at some point that there's many people that have an interest in coming to cyber. And then when I kind of get into it, they're saying this may not actually be truly what I wanted to sign up for. But getting into, the recommendations from your perspective and all the great work that you've done, what are some of those recommendations that you have for our cyber defenders to help strengthen them from a mindset, resiliency perspective to help them thrive at work, but also, of course, in the personal aspect, because we don't, want that to linger and then reflect over to their personal life as well. So kind of what are some thoughts and help them share how they can be better?
So, as a psychologist, the normal thing we try to do is zone in on what's going on inside the head, right? But often we also have to look at what's going on around. Yes, I think there is a need to directly support individuals and give them tools and techniques to keep themselves calm under pressure, whether that's grounding, breathing techniques, things like that, that when, something hits the fan, it keeps them from hitting a 10 out of 10 anxiety and keeps them around a 6 or a 7. However, that individualistic approach is not the only thing we need to do. We need to actually change the structure, the systems around these people so that they're not burning out at the rate that they are. The biggest thing that organizations, I believe, need to do is give their people an ability to switch off. What that actually looks like business to business, depending on what your organization needs to do, will be a little bit different. But the general principle is that if there's even the chance that your phone can go off out of business hours or out of whatever hours you want to align yourself to, and you can be pulled back in, that part of your brain, to use that word, is still active and is still thinking about work, and you're not truly relaxing, you're not truly recharging. And so that's why I think we're seeing people get to the point where they feel like they've got nothing more to give, because even when they've left the office, they know that if a critical incident happens, their phone can go off and they're back in the office. For some roles, it doesn't need to be like that. You can have a system in place where there are people that are on call, but people that are not, and that rotates, right? So when you can relax and when you can't, and stick to that strictly, because otherwise people will not turn on. Of course, the risk there is that, well, there's a legitimate reason why we need to call that person back into the office, and how do we actually justify that we're not going to call that person in even when things are really going bad. So that's where the balance needs to be, because yes, you might think there's a legitimate need, but at the same time, if what's the likelihood of that, and compared to the likelihood of this person burning out? Because maybe they never get called in over a year or two, but just not being able to switch off over that year or two is enough for you to lose that really valuable asset. So that's the first thing, is try your best. It's not always possible, but try your best to give your people a clear time where they know they can recharge. Second thing is, obviously that's not going to work all the time. So it comes back to what I said earlier about appreciation. They need to feel like, yes, even if, a firefighter can get woken up at 1 a.m. and they have to go to work. But we're not seeing the level of burnout in that group that we are in cybersecurity professionals. Partly because they feel appreciated for what they do. They feel like they're fighting the good fight. They feel like they're doing something genuinely worthwhile. And I think to your point earlier where you said that, the people are attracted to the industry, I think quite a lot of people are attracted to the industry because they feel like they are doing some sort of moral good. They are achieving something that is genuinely worthwhile. But once they get into the industry, they don't feel that appreciation. So the second thing is to use whatever influence you can in your own organization to increase the awareness of the rest of the organization about how hard the cyber team work, how critical their role is, how important they are to the protecting the data that all those people rely on. We spend so much time doing awareness training of our staff, and it's always, here's what a password should be, here's what a phishing email looks like. Right, that's fine. I have my own thoughts of whether that is useful or not, but at least we're doing some sort of upskilling there. But what we don't do is upskill them on what the day-to-day life of a cybersecurity professional even looks like. People can picture what a frontline healthcare worker's job is. They can picture what a firefighter's job is, and they can see how that directly has impacts on their own world. People can't picture that for cyber. They picture you sitting at a laptop typing with numbers coming down the screen like in a matrix, and it's not realistic. And it's without that appreciation, they end up being seen as the bad guy. So I'd say they're the two big things. The first is, well, three actually there. The first is, okay, the people themselves, yes, teach them the skills to keep themselves calm under pressure. It's the same thing we do for military and all sorts of other groups, right? And that's what Cybermind does, and it's a fantastic thing to do. Second thing, look at the organization as a whole. What structures and systems are in place that are meaning people can't switch off in particular? And let's try to change that. And then the third is appreciation at management level, but all the way down to awareness of the rest of the organization. They're the big three that I always harp on.
Andrew, thanks so much for coming on the show, introducing those three key personas in cybersecurity: the target, the defender, and the attacker. There's so much more I'd like to discuss with you. It would be great to have you back on Reimagining Cyber sometime soon.
I'd love to, Rob.
Hello, producer Ben here, and the final part of Rob and Dr. Andrew Reeves' conversation. That was Dr. Victor Piotrowski. Thanks for listening to Reimagining Cyber. Don't forget to leave us a positive rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. Goodbye. Episode 56, called How to Create the Best Cybersecurity Workforce. It featured Dr. Victor Piotrowski.
We have to counterbalance, that cliche view, working in cyber means you are in your hoodie in the basement, right? This is the good profession, as good as lawyer or doctor, and very well paid. And you have to hook those students, giving them, exciting experiential things.
That was Dr. Victor Piotrowski. Thanks for listening to Reimagining Cyber. Don't forget to leave us a positive rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. Goodbye.